Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go over chapter 4, which is on operant conditioning. We touched on it a little bit in the last chapter when we talked about Thorndike, but I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to be going through these slides pretty quickly. There's 58 of them, and I'm hoping to do this in 45 minutes or less. So bear with me as I skip through some slides kind of quickly. So so first off, here's a big picture. We're going to walk through an overview, talk about reinforcement schedules. We'll talk about fading, generalization, and discrimination. And then we'll talk about how do you apply operant conditioning. And I think it's important to note that we're going to be talking about B.F. Skinner, the major theorist for this idea, and to step back and say, what was he actually arguing for? And so in his theory, he's looking at the actual behavior of organisms in the context of the conditions that precede the behavior and consequences that follow. What does that mean? So he's looking at behavior and saying the behavior arises in a certain context. You know, there's stimuli, there's things that were occurring before the behavior, and then there's consequences of the behavior that our actions have an effect on the world around us. So in Skinner's view, he's trying to rely exclusively on what we can observe, and he's trying to explain behavior as a product of the context and the consequences. So basically, he's arguing that psychology is an objective science, and we're not going to appeal to mental events or even to physiological events, and instead focus on what we could see outside the person. So we're not going to talk about choices or decisions or needs, things like that. Instead, we're going to focus on just what can we see in the environment around the person and the behavior itself. So the basic idea is that human behavior is lawful. There's patterns and organization to human behavior, and that the causes of behavior are outside the person. So I don't cause myself to behave the way I do. My behavior is a result of what has happened outside of me. And so basically it's trying to identify the laws that govern our behavior. And he actually wrote a novel called Walden 2, where he imagined this utopia. He argued for this idea of, like, what if we had a society that was scientifically based and that used the principles of operant conditioning to deal with people instead of sending people to prison. What if we reinforce their good behaviors, and what kind of society could that possibly be? So he was thinking big picture. He was trying to imagine a better world that uses this framework of operant conditioning. So a little bit of background. B.F. Skinner, his real name is Burris Frederick Skinner, so you can maybe understand why he went by B.F. He's one of the most important names in psychology to know. So certainly one of the top 10, maybe probably top 3 theorists in psychology. And I'll skip some of this. But he was, again, arguing that the causes of behavior are external to the organism. And I'll skip this for time's sake. And he thought about behavior like we think about science in general as independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variables are the things that can be directly manipulated, and then the dependent variables are the things that result. What effect does that have on a person's behavior, on an animal's behavior? And basically, it's trying to understand what's the relationship between independent variables and dependent variables. Now, Skinner believed that classical conditioning explained only a very limited amount of human and animal behavior. So it explained reflexes, right? Salivation, sort of the quail sex conditioning, things like that, the eye blink response. And of course, John Watson expanded that a little bit and said it could also explain our emotional reactions. But Skinner argued, well, okay, that's some of human behavior, but not a whole lot about it. It doesn't explain, how do we go about our lives, and really arguing most of our responses don't come about because we have certain stimuli in our environment. And so classical conditioning, the idea of unconditioned stimuli and conditioned stimuli, just didn't seem like it was a good explanation for a lot of what we do. So Skinner called behavior that was elicited by a stimulus, he called those kind of behaviors or responses respondents. So this would be anything that's classically conditioned. Any kind of behavior that's classically conditioned, he would call respondent behavior. And then he called, and this is where we get the term operant conditioning, he called any behavior that is emitted where it has an effect on the environment is called an operant behavior. It operates to change your environment, right? A lot of what we do, taking a glass of water and drinking it, it's done to change the world around us. And so Skinner argued that that's a operant behavior. And so most behavior is probably operantly oriented. And that could be walking to school, sending a text message, answering a question, smiling at a stranger, scratching a cat's ears. You scratch the cat's ears, it starts to purr. Fishing, well, you fish and you might maybe catch a fish. Driving a car, you arrive at your destination. Singing, reading. I've been thinking about, reading the news. I'm recording this video in the midst of our COVID pandemic, and how when we read the news, we get there's a response to us, and we don't do it because we're prompted to. We do it because we want to know what's occurring. And so again, the known and observable stimuli are not determining that we do those things. Instead, what's central are the consequences of the behaviors. Now, Skinner was influenced by a couple of people in particular, and the first one would be Darwin. So if you think about Charles Darwin, who developed the theory of natural selection, Darwin argued that a species survived by natural fitness, right? Anything that led to its reproduction was going to make it more fit, and therefore more likely to reproduce, and those characteristics would be passed on to the next generation. And those characteristics that don't lead to greater reproductive fitness are going to not be passed on, because those animals within a species won't reproduce and won't pass on their traits to the next generation, or will be less likely. And so in a way, Skinner is taking that idea and said, okay, well, that's for a species. What about for an individual? Well, our behaviors are going to be passed on to ourselves. We're going to continue doing behaviors that lead to good consequences, lead us to adjust better to our situations, and we're going to do less of the behaviors that lead to bad consequences. So we're going to always choose the response that is most adaptive. So it's that same idea, instead of passing along from generation to generation, it's just thinking, okay, across an organism's life, they're going to learn to behave in ways that are generally adaptive. And then, of course, the influence of Thorndike. And Thorndike is really the laid down the foundation for Skinner's ideas on operant conditioning, because Thorndike argued that the consequences of behavior lead to the stamping in, survival, or stamping out, death of responses. Very much the basis of operant conditioning, even though he was using a little bit different terms. So the important part is that consequences are essential. And we talked about classical conditioning. All you needed was contiguity. I'm giving a few different con words as I do this. You could see here. So I don't have it up here, but classical conditioning was based on if two stimuli are presented at about the same time, that whatever response, whatever unconditioned response went with the unconditioned stimulus will be sort of transferred over to the conditioned stimulus. And so you'd have a conditioned response. All you need is for the two stimuli to be presented at the same time. Operant conditioning is a little bit different. You need things to be presented. There needs to be a closeness in time, but it's not about the preceding stimuli, right? That's what classical conditioning, you have stimuli and then the response. Instead, you have the response and then a consequence in operant conditioning. So the consequences determine the probability that the behavior will occur again. And so you could think about it as a contingency, which is just a fancy way of saying an if-then. If I do this, then this will occur. If I scratch a cat's ears, the cat will start purring. That's a contingency. And the organism is, what they're learning is learning this relationship between a response and a contingency, or again, a response and a consequence. So there's two types of conditioning, right? There's classical and then there's operant. So let me start off with what's on the right, the classical conditioning on pigeon length. So this is a review, of course. You have a unconditioned stimulus. So this is where the a type of hook, the textbook uses this example, the Wetaskiwin hook at the end of a string will get maybe pricking the professor's finger. Okay, that's an unconditioned stimulus. That's a painful stimulus to get that in your finger. And that leads to an unconditional response of pain, and you have an accelerated heart rate. But the stimulus is literally the hook going into the finger. Now, the conditioned stimulus, well, that is the color, shape, weight, texture of the Wetaskiwin hook. Just what does it look like? What does it feel like? What is it, what are its characteristics? Those don't elicit pain. Initially it's just a neutral stimulus. But when you combine it with getting pricked multiple times, you can eventually start just looking at that hook, and then you get an accelerated heart rate and you get this fear response. All right, so that's why the professor in our textbook would no longer want to use the Wetaskiwin hook. Now, operant conditioning, that's on the left-hand side, this is a little bit different, right? So you have the fishing behavior. So the first behavior is where the professor uses a copper wire worm with a maggot, and he's jiggling his hand as he's fishing, and he gets one white fish, and then he casts it out again. He uses a Wetaskiwin, and he uses a maggot. He keeps his hand still. He gets no bites, and then he casts out again, has a copper wire, doesn't jiggle, and gets two white fish. And then he uses the Wetaskiwin without the maggot, hand still, again, no bites. And finally, um, uses different lures and with and without bait, and tries jiggling some of the time, and gets, you know, all of those things. So the professor was discovering when he jiggled his hands, he was more likely to catch fish. Now, did that necessarily mean that his hand jiggling was causing the increase in fish? Well, maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. But if he did that and it was associated with the consequence of getting more fish, then he's probably going to increase it. And that's basically what operant conditioning is all about, that we increase the behaviors that lead to positive consequences. Now, the contingencies. Well, Skinner talked about this and used terms of either a reinforcer or a punisher. And what's really important is that a reinforcer is any event that follows a response and increases the probability of the response occurring again. So if the behavior increases in the future, that consequence is a reinforcer, regardless of what we might like. We might look at it and be like, that doesn't seem like a reinforcer. You know, a guy asks out a girl and gets slapped. He might say, oh, he got punished for it. But if he goes and asks more girls out, gets slapped by each one, that slap is a reinforcer. All right. So it's defined not as like what we might think what effect it would have on a person. It's defined as what are the real consequences to the behavior. A punisher, in turn, is an event that follows a response and decreases the probability. So a reinforcer will increase your likelihood of behaving a certain way. A punisher is one that will decrease the likelihood that you're going to behave a certain way. So then you have two types of reinforcement. Okay, so just if you talk only about reinforcement, Skinner introduced this idea, and some of you may have heard this before because this has been discussed in like general psychology. You have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is often, these ideas are often misunderstood. So make sure you get this because it's an important part. Positive reinforcement is where you add something to a situation, and because it's reinforcement, it's going to increase the probability of the behavior. Negative reinforcement is where you take something away and it will increase the probability of the behavior. Okay, so let me help you understand. If I were to, with my daughter, if I were to give her, let's see here, what is she like? If I were to give her a candy after she cleared her dishes and put them in the dishwasher, if in the future that candy consequence led her to clear her dishes without being asked to get that candy, that would be positive reinforcement. I'm adding candy to her environment. Now, negative reinforcement would be if she, if I say, oh, if you clear your plate, you don't have to eat your peas. Okay, what I'm doing is I'm taking away a negative stimulus. I'm saying you don't have to eat your peas if you clear your plate. Well, if she doesn't like peas, then that actually will increase her behavior, right? She'll be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna clear my plate, and then I don't have to eat my peas. And again, it's reinforcement because she's more likely to clear her plate, but something's being taken away. The peas are being taken away. She doesn't have to eat them. And so as a result, that's negative reinforcement. So you can think about positive reinforcement as pleasure. It's pleasurable to get something like candy. And then negative reinforcement is relief. You're relieved because you don't have to eat peas. And again, it's all about whether something's being added or taken away. Now, punishment has the same ideas: positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment is when a negative contingency is added. So if I were to, let's see here, say that if she were to, sorry, I'm thinking of an idea here. If she were to yell at her brother and hit her brother or something like that, and we say, okay, you hit your brother, you're going to have to eat your peas. Well, that's positive punishment. I'm adding a situation that wasn't there before. I'm saying, okay, now you have to eat your peas. Again, assuming that she didn't have peas on her plate before. I'm adding a consequence. She didn't have to deal with it before, now she does. So you can think of that as sort of a pain. Another one is like spanking. Spanking is a positive punishment. You're introducing pain to a person's life as a consequence for their behavior. Negative punishment is when something that's positive is removed. So if I were to, my daughter loves her tablet. If I were to take her tablet away when she's misbehaving, that would be negative punishment. She's experiencing a loss. So you can shape it. Again, positive and negative doesn't refer to, all it refers to is something being added to the situation or is something being taken away. So again, negative reinforcement is often confused with punishment. Negative reinforcement is a procedure that increases the probability of a behavior. Punishment involves introducing a negative contingency or terminating a positive one in order to decrease the probability of a behavior. I have a clip on the multimedia that is from Big Bang Theory, where Sheldon is trying to condition Penny's behavior. I really encourage you to watch it. It's pretty funny. But in it, they actually make a mistake. They call I believe it's they're spraying a spray bottle at one part of the clip, and he talks about it as negative reinforcement, as if like that's basically the spray bottle is actually a positive punishment. You're adding a uncomfortable consequence, but they misnamed it. So again, this is often confused. So I have this graphic here. On the columns are let me start with the rows. The first row is where something is added to a situation after a response. So both of those are positive. And the second row, going across again, the second row is where something is taken away from a situation after a response. So both of those are negative. Okay, so the top row is positive, bottom row is negative. Now, the columns, the first column is where what's being added. Is it, the first column is about what's being involved in the situation. Is it a positive contingency? Is it something that is pleasurable and enjoyable? Okay, so if you add in that first square, if you add a positive contingency, an appetitive contingency, that's positive reinforcement. If you give a dollar for behaving well, you're going to strengthen the behavior. But if you go down, if you take away a positive contingency, you're going to take away something that they like, and that's going to be negative punishment, right? You're taking away something that they like. So that's going to be, they're going to be like, oh, wow, I lost my tablet. I lost, so let's say Sam has his dollar taken away for misbehaving. That's going to potentially weaken the behavior. Second column, you add a negative contingency, a aversive one, then that's going to be positive punishment. So you have Sam has his ears pulled for misbehaving. You're adding something, pulling the ear, but it's unpleasant. So that actually functions as positive punishment. And then on the final square, you have something is taken away. And what's taken away? A negative contingency. So you take away something a person doesn't like. So Sam's ears are released when he behaves again. So when you release that, there's a sense of relief, and that's going to strengthen their behavior. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. All right, now another component is talking about reinforcement schedules, and there's a few different things that they look at. How quickly do you acquire behavior? How quickly do you respond? What's your rate of response? And how quickly do you extinguish the behavior so that they don't behave a certain way? So you have the acquisition, it's like the increase of the behavior. The middle part is just how quickly do they behave on an ongoing basis. And then what if you stop giving them consequences? How quickly will the behavior extinguish? And all of these are in regards to reinforcement. So you see they're all reinforcement schedules. This is not for punishment schedules. All right, so there's 3 basic ways that you can have a reinforcement schedule. You could continuously reinforce. So every time you do something, you get reinforced for it. So I just think like when I itch, every time I itch, it kind of feels good. That's continuous reinforcement. Every response is reinforced. Then you could have, and there's a lot of these, intermittent reinforcement. This is where reinforcement occurs only some of the time. I will explain. There's 4 different types of intermittent reinforcement, so I'll walk you through those. Actually 5. And then you have a combined or concurrent schedule. And this is combining continuous with intermittent reinforcement. So you can see that here. Continuous is where every correct response is reinforced. And then intermittent, you have the 4 types. You have 2 types that are ratio, and I'll explain this in a minute, and 2 types that are interval. You have fixed ratio and random ratio, also sometimes called variable ratio, and then fixed interval and random interval or variable interval. And then finally you have superstitious, which is kind of an interesting one. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you can have, again, the combination of continuous and intermittent. That's called concurrent here. All right, so let's start with the fixed ratio. That's what FR stands for. Fixed ratio. So here's a couple of examples. In a fixed ratio, it's not continuous. You're not giving a consequence every single time, but you're giving a consequence every certain number of times. So a child can get a gold star each day she picks up her toys. At the end of the week, 5 gold stars can be exchanged for a toy. So she does it, if she does it 5 times, she picks up her toys, she gets a toy. So each day she gets a little sticker to sort of symbolize that she's on her way to get a toy, but what really matters is the toy itself. So the fixed ratio is 5. Every 5 times you have a behavior, in this case picking up the toys, you get a toy. Another example, chewing gum, to take away bad breath, 1 stick of gum equals 1 negative reinforcement, so you have no more bad breath. So that's a fixed ratio of 1. Then you can have a fixed interval. And the difference between ratio and interval is a little tricky, but instead of being a certain number of times, it's a certain period of time, and it's a certain interval of time. So if you have a magazine article, if you're working as a writer for a magazine, you might have a due date every week. And you would, if you meet your due date, you're going to get a reward. If you write 2 articles in a week, you're not going to get any reinforcement. It's just going to be like, oh, why'd you write an extra article? And it's going to be worthless to the magazine, assuming that they can only fit 1 in. Another example is where you might get a seniority raise every 2nd year you work at a job. So you get this fixed interval. If you're working hard, then you're gonna get this seniority raise. If you work really, really hard, it's not like the raise will come any sooner. You have to just work at this hard enough, productive enough, and then you'll get it that 2nd year. And then both of those are fixed ratio and fixed interval. And then you can also have variable ratio and variable interval. So let's imagine you're a telemarketer, and on average, you make 2 sales per 20 phone calls. If you're doing this, you don't actually know. You're calling up a person. You don't know when the next person will be that will make a sale. I mean, it could be, you make 10 calls, and the 10th call's the one that that makes a sale, and then another 10 that makes a sale. But it could also be, you can make 100 phone calls and perhaps not have any sales in those 100 phone calls. Because it's random, you just don't know. You also don't know if you make a sale, it could be the very next sale, you also get a sale. Again, that's the unpredictability of it. Another example, you could play bingo. You could figure out the odds of winning on any card. You say, oh, well, it's 1 in 100. You may win 1 in 100 cards on average, but you could win, and then potentially you could also win again. And gambling in general is a good example of this. That when you gamble, you can play the slot, you can, pull it and win, and then you could potentially put another coin in, pull the slot, and you could win the very next time. And so this variable ratio is actually a really, really powerful way of shaping a behavior, increasing a behavior. And then variable interval is where you have unpredictability in the time period, right? The fixed interval, you knew exactly how much time needed to pass before you can get another reinforcement. But let's say you're a surfer and you're waiting for the next big wave, you don't know when that will come. It's hard to predict, and so you just hang out in the vicinity just in case. So I'm noting the time. I'm going much slower than I was hoping. I'm going to go a little bit quicker to speed it up. I won't get through in 45 minutes, so but I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit. Basically, if you use these methods, if you start off with a variable or inconsistent reinforcement, you learn it very slowly. If you want a person to learn a behavior, to pick up a behavior, at first, reinforce them every single time. This shows that if you don't do it every single time, it could sometimes take a while for them to actually realize, oh, and this is using like an example of a rat pressing a lever. If you have to press it 5 times, it's not going to press the lever very fast until it sort of figures out that, oh, if I press this 5 times, that's when I get it. I'll skip that. But what the research on this has found is that if you do continuous reinforcement, you learn quickly, you acquire quickly, but you don't really respond very quickly after that point. If you use interval reinforcement, you will learn slowly, and then there's a pattern. You have a brief lag after the reward, and then you after that have an increasing response rate. Ratio reinforcement is where there's a higher response rate than continuous. And so the rate of responding is highest for random ratio schedules. Again, if you are trying to develop a high rate of a behavior, if you want to train your workers, or people like a client that you're working with, a good way to reinforce their behavior is on a variable ratio schedule or a random ratio schedule. And you can see that here. If you use fixed interval, basically people will act really intensely for a short period of time and then basically stop acting, because they know if I do it right now, I'm not going to get rewarded. So they sort of have this up and down. If you ever find yourself procrastinating, it's probably because you've been operating with a fixed interval reinforcement, right? You turn in papers when the due date is, and as a result, you've been conditioned to operate under fixed interval, and this is what your behavior looks like. You have the peak of your behavior. You're cramming, writing that paper. You're working hard, and then you sort of crash. It's probably because you've been operating under a fixed interval schedule. All right, so the acquisition is best if you use continuous reinforcement. The rate of response is best if you used sort of a inconsistent, intermittent reinforcement, particularly the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. But what about extinction, right? Because those are the three things: acquisition, rate of responding, and extinction. Well, if you want something to extinguish quickly, it's going to happen quickest if you had a continuous schedule. So if you, every single time we're reinforcing a behavior and then you suddenly stop, the person or the animal is going to figure out very quickly, oh, I'm not getting reinforced, I'm going to stop behaving this way. If you have a fixed schedule, it occurs more rapidly than a variable schedule. So the slowest extinction, the hardest behavior to extinguish, is variable schedule, variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. So the gambling is so hard to extinguish as a behavior because you don't know when that next reward is going to come. So let's say a slot machine breaks and no longer will pay out money. That a person could play on that slot machine and think, oh, it's going to be the next time. Oh, it's going to be the next time. Oh, it's going to be the next time. Their behavior can go on a long, long time without extinction. It's because they just don't know when the next reinforcement is going to occur. So really, there's this trade-off between initial learning and then the rate of responding and extinction. And so intermittent schedules of reinforcement are used when they're used in initial learning, the response is haphazard and slow, but the behavior is hard to extinguish. There's one other idea that factors in. We talked about it with classical conditioning. So let's say you stop reinforcing a behavior. Well, what happens if you put and imagine a rat. So this rat is trained, press the lever every 3 times, you're going to get a pellet, and then it does it, and then they're reinforcing, and then they suddenly stop the experiment. They don't give the pellet. That rat's going to press the lever, and be like, okay, and it's going to eventually stop pressing the lever because it's going to realize, oh, I'm not getting any food pellets. But then if you put that rat back into this box 2 days later or sometime later, then that rat will try it again. It's going to have a spontaneous recovery of the behavior. So that's what they're talking about with that. This slide just points out extinction is not the same as forgetting. It's not like they forgot what occurred, that they had this reinforcement. It's a different process. All right. I'm going to move a little quicker again. There's two main types of reinforcement or techniques for reinforcement. The first is shaping. So shaping is where if I were to um, my son was swinging a bat the other day, learning how like t-ball. He's 4 years old. He's trying to hit the ball. If I wanted him to start off and I didn't care about his technique, I might try to like get him to just whack it, and then but gradually I might I might say good job when he uses better form, and then gradually I might shape his behavior so that each time he's swinging the bat, I'm only reinforcing if the swing is proper form. Well, that'd be an example of shaping. Another example of shaping, if you're training dogs and you want them to do this behavior, you might find at first, okay, they, well, for instance, one of the ways that they first train dogs is they get them to just focus. And if the dog is able to focus for 2 seconds, you give them a treat at first. But then gradually you would want them to stay focused, move, not move, keep its eyes on you. And you might start reinforcing after 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds. And you might gradually get more and more to the point where you're getting closer to like what you really want, which is them to stay still for like 20 seconds. So shaping is really a good way to change a behavior. Another tool, and again, people get this confused, is chaining. Chaining is where you reinforce one particular behavior, and then you chain it together into a sequence. Think of a literal chain. It's these sequences of behaviors. So when you see dogs at the dog show where they're doing particular tricks, well, initially they reinforced for one behavior and then reinforced for another behavior, but then they put them together, right? You have a whole sequence of tricks that they're doing. That's an example of chaining. And of course, you use chains, you use shaping for each of the chains, and then you can chain them together. Okay. A couple more ideas. Now, it's really important. It is this idea that, of course, operant conditioning is the relationship between response and consequence. Remember, the behaviors say it's stimulus, response, consequence. That's what's happening before the behavior, what's the behavior, and what are the consequences of the behavior. And classical conditioning is really about the stimulus and the response. Operant conditioning is mostly about the response and the consequence. But in operant conditioning, they talk about discriminative stimuli. This is the behavior, the stimuli before the behavior. And so as an example, you can have a behavior, speeding, and the consequences of speeding will vary depending on whether a police officer is present. The consequence, if the police officer is not there, is, well, you might arrive more quickly. If the police officer is there, what is the consequence? Well, you may get a ticket. So discriminative stimuli is that the consequences, we recognize that the consequences for our behaviors differ depending on the context, right? You might say a crude joke to a close friend of yours, but you might not say that to your grandma. The consequence may be a little bit different. Now, eating is another example. You can eat, and the consequence of eating can depend upon, what are you eating? So you can eat chocolate cake, that's going to be pleasant, rewarding, or you can eat dirt, that's not going to be so pleasant. And again, that's about the initial context. What is it that you're interacting with? I'm going to skip over this for sake of time. So how do you use operant conditioning? So society tends to use a lot of aversive control. We use things like reprimands. We chastise kids for their behavior. We use things like detention. We give kids who don't do well low grades. We might have threats of punishment. We might use prisons, things like that. So society has used aversive contingencies. And what operant conditioning suggests, well, the research suggests that reinforcement is more effective than punishment. So reinforcement of good behavior, right? You don't want to reinforce bad behavior. You want to reinforce good behavior, and that is more likely to lead to the kind of behavior that you want to see than punishing bad behavior is. And this is a hard thing to take into account, but it's one of those things that I hope you take away from this class, that instead of thinking about how do I punish the bad behavior, that may be needed in some circumstances, but instead think, how do I encourage and reinforce the good behaviors I want to see in my kids, in clients that I'm working with, and in people within society generally. If you're ever a teacher, well, teachers need to know this. They need to know that you're more likely to bring about good changes in behavior if you reinforce. And they should know that at first you might want to use a continuous schedule of reinforcement and then switch to a intermittent schedule of reinforcement, like a fixed ratio or a variable ratio or fixed interval. Again, punishment is not very effective for learning. And ideally, I didn't talk about this yet, but there should be a shorter delay between the behavior and its consequence. Now, there's some other ideas. How do you reinforce? Well, I gave an example of candy. That's a consumable. You can have consumables, you can have manipulatables, you can have visual and auditory stimuli, and I get a kick out of this. Kids love things like bells and whistles and different things like that you can, they just enjoy it. The stimulus is a reinforcement. And so you don't even have to give them anything. You just give them a pleasant experience. One of my coworkers has this gong that he rings, and it's just it's a pleasant sound. Other reinforcers can be social stimuli, saying "good job, way to go," things like that. I mean, again, sometimes reinforcement, we think about it as, oh, I have to buy things. No, you don't have to do that all the time. And then tokens, these can be stars that can be traded in for toys. So these are sort of representative things. And however, the problem with reinforcers is, and you have to be real about this, is they do vary from person to person. And there's a little bit of a cyclical definition. What is a reinforcer? It's something that reinforces. So it's something that increases a behavior. But there is a trick, and I like to point this out. It's called the Premack Principle. If you want to figure out, how do I reinforce? If you have a child in your life, maybe your child, maybe a nephew, niece, if you want to figure out, how do I reinforce their behavior? Well, watch what they do. Anything that any behavior that they do naturally could be a reinforcer. So if they like to draw, read, play sports, well, what you could do is say, okay, if you clean up your room, you get to draw. If you clean up your room, you get to read. And you can make the thing that they do naturally, that could be a reinforcer of the behavior that you want to see them do. You could say, oh, I'll buy you a book, basically saying, I'll give you ability to read if you do these things. And so what that basically says, watch people pay attention to their hobbies, their interests, things that they naturally do with their time, and that's the best way to reinforce them. Now, I do want to talk a little bit, and again, I'm going way over my time, 55 minutes, but I do want to talk about corporal punishment, right? Because corporal punishment is the most developed, most developed countries have banned the use of physical punishment. Um, and it's interesting because the US is not one of those. There are still states and to be honest, it kind of surprises me that this is the case. But there are still states that will allow schools to use corporal punishment. So kids in some school districts are still being spanked. And for me, again, that's kind of amazing. But I want to talk a little bit about it because I know some of you may have some varying opinions on corporal punishment and want to address that. So first off, I want to give the case. Why not? Why should we not use corporal punishment? Well, the first thing that opponents would point out is that by punishing bad behavior, it's unlikely that good behavior will occur. So you might, if it works, you might decrease that bad behavior, again, in the best case scenario, but you're not going to increase like pro-social behaviors like giving and being kind to each other. They might just not be mean to each other, but they might not be kind. I'm thinking of children. And another factor is instead of eliminating bad behavior, punishment only suppresses it. So potentially they may hide their bad behavior. Another factor is punishment can lead to negative emotional states. So we know that physical punishment can lead to depression. It's associated with depression and anxiety. It's also, and maybe this isn't terribly surprising, but something to consider, it's associated with more violent behavior. So kids that are spanked are more likely to be aggressive and to use violent behavior on other kids and grow up to be use violence as adults. Okay, now another factor, and of course we don't think that we'd be liable to do this, but we know that physical punishment puts children at risk for abuse. So oftentimes abuse doesn't start as abuse. It's an escalation from spanking to hard spanking to punches and things like that. And or maybe it's like pushing against a wall, things like that, and it escalates because the parent's like, well, I'm trying it. It got their attention at first, but now it doesn't. So let me try it a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And generally they find that's a process for arriving at abuse. Finally, generally the finding is that punishment frequently does not work. And again, I'm mainly speaking to corporal punishment. I'm mainly speaking to physical punishment like spanking and things like that. But some of this also applies generally to punishment. Now, there are a few less objectionable forms of punishment that can be timeouts. Timeout technically is a shortened phrase of timeout from positive reinforcement. That's the full phrase. So you're taking them out of something that they enjoy. You're taking them away from playing, usually, and you're putting them in a space where they don't have reinforcement. So it's a negative punishment. It's not a positive punishment, it's a negative punishment because you're taking them out of a positive circumstance. Reprimands, well, these are statements that you can say, don't do that, you shouldn't do that. Well, what the research has found is that soft is better than loud. So the best way to reprimand a child is to do it in a way that only the child can hear. So teachers shouldn't publicly reprimand a child in front of all the other students. They should walk next to the child, speak to them and say, I'd like you to stop doing that. And same with parents. Parents should speak specifically to one of their children and not publicly embarrass them in front of their other siblings. And you know that um, probably applies to employees as well. And we should be careful not to publicly humiliate our employees if you have any working for you. But I also want to give it some space for punishment, right? So reinforcement, um, trying to reason, trying to get a child to imitate, they could be effective in bringing about desirable behavior, but sometimes they're not sufficient. Um, there are situations in which using punishment seems the least cruel and most effective of alternatives. So I give the example, my son for a period was kind of fascinated with some electrical outlets. Now, we were using, the plug outlet plugs, but sometimes you miss one. Sometimes you worry that it's he could find one and again shock himself, right? That'd be potentially pretty bad consequences. And so I I remember at one time I grabbed his hand and I slapped it, and I thought, okay, this seems okay, because what I want to do is bring about a punishment for him trying to stick his finger in the socket. It might not be perfect, but I felt okay with it because uh, it was, what are the alternatives? I could try to attract his attention to other things, but potentially if if that doesn't work, I don't want it to risk his well-being. And so again, I, I think sometimes we've moved a little too far away from punishment. The research says that punishment can work. It has to be done quickly and immediately, and it needs to be done in the right format. Um, and it can change behavior. You just, again, need to be real careful about it. Now, one application clinically is a field called behavioral analysis, also known as applied behavioral analysis. So this is where they've taken these principles of operant conditioning and said, well, how do we affect human behavior? So behavioral analysis, if you've never heard of it, it's used with children and people with disabilities. So what they do is they try to identify dysfunctional behavior, right? And that's the behavior, of course, like tantrums, distractibility, poor social skills, and then they try to work on altering the consequences. And so this is actually, if you've never heard of it, a really valuable line of work. Well, there's a huge need for applied behavioral analysis, and surprisingly, you can actually be a behavioral interventionist with just a bachelor's degree. In fact, some of our students here at APU work as behavioral interventionists even before they complete their bachelor's degree. So it's just a career path that you might want to look into. Now, relatedly, but it's a little bit different, is the idea of behavioral therapy. And so behavioral therapy will use things like prompting, positive reinforcement, counter conditioning, extinction, to deal with a variety of conditions. And that includes, and um, we already saw the video of the snake phobia. That was behavioral therapy. But one example is actually behavioral addictions. So we talked about substance use disorders or drug addictions. Behavioral addictions are sort of in a gray area because they're not always recognized by the DSM, but they're essentially addiction to certain behaviors. And what they find is that there's a lot of similarities between drug addictions and these behavioral addictions. So they produce euphoria, they can decrease negative emotions like stress and depression. And so, well, when you think about that, it produces euphoria, so that's positive reinforcement. You're introducing euphoric feelings to a situation. So if I gamble, I feel excited. If I shop, I get, well, excited. I can find things that I like and that I want to wear. If I am sex addict, then I have the pleasure of a sexual act. So it produces euphoria. So it has positive reinforcement, and it also has negative reinforcement because it decreases negative emotions. So you've probably heard of this idea of self-medication. Yeah, that can certainly play into this. That part of addiction is taking away negative emotions. So um, if you have like PTSD, that sort of post-traumatic stress, an addiction can sort of lessen it, right? You get this excitement, this good feeling, and you feel less of your depression, your anxiety, your stress, and so again, that's negative reinforcement. So how do you apply that with behavioral addictions? Well, I mentioned this before, I'll echo it again. You identify discriminative stimuli. So these are situations that signal the addictive behavior. So what are the situations where the addictive behavior are most likely to occur? Is it when they're having a conflict with their spouse? Is it when um, their work is stressful, or is it certain situations when they're traveling, or regardless, you just identify the triggers, you encourage alternative responses. So you reinforce other behavior, alternative behavior. So one way to do this is you delay the response. So you create these waiting periods. So if you are wanting to buy something and you have like a shopping addiction, you say, okay, I will buy this, but I have to wait. And sometimes it can just be like 15 minutes or, a fairly short period of time, and say, okay, I'm going to reevaluate in 15 minutes. If I still want to buy it, I can buy it. And oftentimes delaying the response leads to less of the behavior. So if someone's like, oh, I have a pornography addiction, you can say, all right, when you think about this, delay the period of time before you actually look at pornography. Another example is find behaviors the person finds rewarding and that can be used when triggered. So you find like, is there a way that they could relax and cope, right? Because if they're trying to eliminate negative emotions, let's find another way that they can eliminate negative emotions. If they're trying to experience euphoria, maybe going for a hike or getting out, playing with your dogs, things like that. Maybe that could be give enough of that sensation of euphoria that the person doesn't have to engage in their behavioral addiction. And then finally, you look for ways to alter the consequences. Maybe potentially, and I don't know if this is the best way, you increase how guilty they might feel, because they'll know that they're going to have to, if you're your therapist, they'll know that they're going to have to talk about it with you. And sometimes that can alter the consequences, that when they do it, they feel more guilty and they feel like embarrassed. And sometimes that can change the way that they behave. So again, you have identify the triggers, because again, the behavior is stimulus, response, consequence. So stimulus, identify the triggers. Response, look for alternative responses, and then alter the consequences if you can. All right, and identifying reinforcers. Behaviors serve a function. They are not just happenstance actions. So even depressed behaviors can be subtly reinforced. So depression, interestingly, is actually reinforcing. If you say, oh, I'm feeling really depressed, sometimes people will pay more attention to you and they might support you. And in a way, that's actually reinforcing the depression. Even thoughts of suicide can be comforting to some people, and because they say, oh, well, at least there's an out. And so in times where they feel really depressed or really like down, the thought of suicide can actually feel relieving to people, right? And relief is negative reinforcement. It's taking away, oh, I feel trapped. Well, oh, there's an escape. And then ruminating feels rewarding in the short run. So if you play a script in your head and you think about things over and over and over again, let's say if you worry about something, well, if you worry about something and the negative event actually occurs, there's less of a negative response to it. And so, again, there's these identifying the reinforcers can help you figure out how to change the behavior. And finally, there's some parenting applications. You can reward good behavior with attention, praise, stickers, stars, money, or money I want to highly encourage. Or you can allow them to do activities they naturally spend time doing. So you say, if you clean your room, you can play video games. If you do this, you can watch TV. And I'd say you can punish bad behavior with timeouts or by non-public reprimands, but do be careful. In fact, the experts recommend do not use spanking or physical punishment to change a child's behavior. And again, I know that's a hard thing to for some people to grapple with, but there's enough research out there that suggests that it can be pretty problematic, especially for some kids, that it's not the best way to change their behavior. All right. Okay, so I went a little bit longer than I was hoping for, but hopefully this was helpful to unpack some of this material. I know that there were some controversial ideas that I touched on. Hopefully you get a chance to kind of share about those on the discussion boards. And yeah, good luck.